All right, everyone. Well, first off, good evening. Thank you all so much for coming out to Louisiana's Old State Capitol Museum tonight. Very excited to have you here. My name is Ashley Franklin. I'm the education curator, and it is our mission as part of Secretary of State Nancy Landry's department to help educate the public on Louisiana's rich history through lectures, exhibits, and programs. Speaking of that, I do want to let everyone know we have two brief surveys for everybody. After tonight's lecture, if you wouldn't mind taking a moment, they can be found at that background table by those double doors. Oh. And then you'll just leave those and we will definitely use that information for future programs. Tonight, we have Dr. John Rodrigue, author and history professor at Stonehill College in Massachusetts. Dr. Rodrigue will be the third speaker in a series of guest lectures surrounding the Reconstruction time period. His teaching and research focuses on 19th century United States history and Southern history, in particular the Civil War and Reconstruction era, and slavery and emancipation. Dr. Rodrigue is also part of our Scholar Advisory Council for the Old State Capitol's upcoming exhibition on Reconstruction. He received his PhD from Emory University and has previously worked at LSU. He was also president of the Louisiana Historical Association here for several years. He has authored many publications, and tonight Dr. Rodrigue joins us for a talk on his most recent book, Freedom's Crescent, the Civil War and the Destruction of Slavery in the Lower Mississippi Valley. This book was a finalist for the Gilder Lerner Lincoln Prize. After tonight's talk, he'll be over here signing and selling copies of his book for anyone that is interested. And at this point, I'd like to welcome Dr. Rodrigue on up here to the stage.
Thank you, and good evening. Let me just get adjusted here. Okay, thank you for that introduction, Ashley, and thank you for the invitation to speak as part of this series, and for participating in the Reconstruction initiative. Thank you all for coming tonight. It's always nice to be able to speak about one's work, and what self-respecting author and college professor will not welcome the opportunity of an open microphone to talk about his or her own work. I taught at LSU, as some of you may know, a couple of lifetimes ago, from 1996 to 2007. And so this may not necessarily be the return of the prodigal son, but I actually have spoken in this room at least once during my time at LSU. And how often, for the historians here in the building, how often do we get to talk in a venue where the things in our book actually happened? Admittedly, not a lot of the story happened in this building, but secession was actually formally declared not only in this building, but indeed in this room in 1861. And so I'm going to give an overview of my book, Freedom's Crescent. This is part of a Reconstruction series, but I guess I'm the third speaker. We're kind of ending at the beginning because I'm talking about the Civil War and wartime Reconstruction. So I'm going to be kind of anticipating a lot of the things that will actually happen, after the war. And so that I'm going to give an overview of my book, talk about the main themes, and accent some of the things that were going on, particularly in Louisiana. And of the various communities and states that I'm looking at in this book, Louisiana certainly is the most important one. Book talks there's kind of basically two approaches to book talks, I guess. There's the one that's predicated upon the assumption that the audience has read the book or will read the book. And if the audience has read the book, then it's kind of tedious to give an overview of something that most people have read, right? Whereas the other mode is kind of behind the scenes, how I came to do this book. I'm going to assume that most of you have not read the book, and maybe persuade, some to maybe pursue it further. So I am going to be giving a bit of an overview of the book, but I will talk a little bit about how I came to write the book and a little bit of, the sort of the story of the book itself. Okay. So the destruction of slavery in the lower Mississippi Valley. This book is essentially a study of Louisiana, Tennessee, Arkansas, and Mississippi during the Civil War. And it looks at the 5-year period from Lincoln's election in November of 1860 through the final ratification of the 13th Amendment in December of 1865. So it's looking at a 5-year period. And I'm going to start with a quotation from Abraham Lincoln, which may not make a lot of sense at first, but I hope that, in the course of my presentation, it will become clearer, because when we first hear it, it might sound really weird. In November of 1863, right? So this is November of 1863, right around the time that Lincoln has given the Gettysburg Address. And it's 10 months after the Emancipation Proclamation, right, which was issued on January 1st, 1863. He writes a letter which becomes fairly well known in the story of Reconstruction, wartime Reconstruction, and particularly with reference to Louisiana. And he's writing to General Nathaniel Banks, who is the military commander of the Department of the Gulf in New Orleans. New Orleans had been conquered by federal forces the previous year in April of 1862, right? So this is well after a year, maybe a year and a half, since New Orleans had been conquered. Lincoln is bemoaning the lack of progress in organizing a loyal Free State government in Louisiana, in New Orleans and the occupied part of southern Louisiana. And so he writes to Banks to try to get things going. And he says, in uncharacteristically blunt language for Lincoln, this lack of progress, Lincoln says, disappoints me bitterly. Banks and others had given Lincoln previously to understand that the Free State Initiative had been moving well and advancing. And Lincoln urged Banks and the Free State Unionists in New Orleans, he said, to give me a tangible nucleus which the remainder of the state may rally around as fast as it can, and which I can at once recognize and sustain as the true state government. So he's trying to get Banks to move forward. Time is important, Lincoln continues. There is danger even now that the adverse element seeks insidiously to preoccupy the ground. Worse still, to continue the quote, if a few professedly loyal men shall draw the disloyal about them and colorably set up a state government repudiating the Emancipation Proclamation and reestablishing slavery, I cannot recognize or sustain their attempt. I should fall powerless in the attempt. Such a government, Lincoln insisted, using familiar language, would be a house divided against itself. And so Lincoln again urged Banks to form a government, a free state unionist government, as quickly as possible, adding that my word is to be out for and not against the former slaves on the question of their permanent freedom. Now, how can Lincoln, this is November of 1863. Again, this is 10 months after the Emancipation Proclamation, and Lincoln is worried about the possibility of a few professedly loyal men setting up a loyal state government and repudiating the Emancipation Proclamation and reestablishing slavery. That doesn't make any sense to us, right? But I think if we kind of understand the larger context in which Lincoln is writing to Banks, then this will become clearer, and it will make perfect sense why Lincoln is actually worried at this point in the war, after Vicksburg and the victories at Vicksburg and Gettysburg, why there would be the possibility of establishing a government that still has slavery in Louisiana. And so that's one of the things that one of the central problems that I'm dealing with in this book. a study of the destruction of slavery in the lower Mississippi Valley. So again, I'm looking at the period from 1860, November of 1860 to late 1865, a roughly 5-year period. And I'm looking at the 4 states of this region that joined the Confederacy. So again, Louisiana, Mississippi, Arkansas, and Tennessee. And so if we could switch to the next slide. This is just the rough, this is the, obviously the region that I'm studying. And let's see if we can, yep, there we go. So just, that's the overall picture. The printing may be a little bit hard to read, but that's the area that I'm dealing with. Careful readers may note a couple of mistakes on this map. It took me a while to find them. Asheville, North Carolina is misspelled. And there's another one that I noticed, Sylvia, I think I forgot to mention this to you. There's another one, Birmingham, Alabama is on this map, and Birmingham, Alabama did not exist at this point in history. So that's my bad. I didn't catch that one in time. Okay, so this is the area that I'm looking at. And what I'm doing in this book is this is a book, I'm pulling together in a general narrative, an overall narrative. I'm pulling together political developments in these states, particularly Louisiana and Tennessee and Arkansas. There's not much unionism going on in Mississippi during the war, but I'm pulling together the political story in these states, what's going on in Washington, D.C. with Lincoln and Congress. It's also looking at the military narrative and pulling, bringing in the military narrative and story. And it's also dealing with the on-the-ground destruction of slavery by the enslaved people themselves and drawing on that vast literature of which I have been able to participate in my own work, in emphasizing the slave's role in the destruction of slavery. And so this is really the first book of all of the scholarship on these various aspects of the Civil War period in this area. This is the first book to really pull together all of these different strands, the political, the military, the social and economic story, and put it together in one book. And this is the first time that it's been done. There's no other book that has done this. Studies of slavery, general studies of slavery and emancipation have focused a lot of attention on this area, on the lower Mississippi Valley. Of course, there's a vast military scholarship on this area. Wartime Reconstruction, particularly in Louisiana and Tennessee, has been studied. But this book kind of tries to pull all of this together in one volume. And this is very much just building on the work that I have done. I say in the introduction, I feel like I've been working on this book for 30 years, even though I wasn't. The idea came to me in kind of around 2012 is when I had the idea for this book. And it came out of my previous book on Lincoln and Reconstruction. But doing this book allowed me to draw on work that I have been doing throughout my entire career, from my dissertation, which became my first book on the Louisiana sugar region and emancipation in that area, the work that I did on the Freedmen in Southern Society project, a documentary history of emancipation, and then the teaching I did at LSU, and then subsequently the teaching that I've done at Stonehill. And it was when I went to Stonehill that I really began to seriously study Lincoln more intensely. I'd always been involved with Lincoln my entire career, but it's after I went to Stonehill I began to more seriously immerse myself in the scholarship on Lincoln, and so I'm drawing on that in this book as well. So that's kind of a very brief overview of where the book came from and what I'm trying to do. So if we could go to the next slide. This just gives us a very, very quick picture of slavery in the lower Mississippi Valley. And you can tell, right, the darker the colors, the higher percentage of slaves in a particular county or region. I could have broken this down more. In fact, some of those, the darkest one, the black parishes and counties are more than 50% slave. But some of those parishes and counties were as high as 70, 75, 90% slave. And so this gives you a quick image of the importance of slavery to this area, but then also the importance of plantation agriculture, right, to this area. And while my book is dealing with all 4 states, it's really focusing on the area where slavery and plantation agriculture predominated, because that's where the real action was, obviously, in looking at the destruction of slavery. So you can tell central and eastern Tennessee, I'm not really dealing with quite so much, but I deal with insofar as I have to deal with state level developments in Tennessee. So in a way, right, this picture and the one that I'm going to show next would pretty much be the thesis of my book in many respects. This gives us an image of the area before the war, obviously. And this area here, southeastern Louisiana, the sugar country, is the area that I had studied in my dissertation and my first book. So this gives us a sense of, the centrality and the importance of slavery to this region. And there were over 1 million enslaved people in the 4 states of the lower Mississippi Valley. So that just gives us an overview of the importance of slavery. Okay, now there are basically 2 main themes, if you will, and if I can get into the kind of interpretive questions that scholars deal with. I promise I'll speak in English and not academic jargon, but there are 2 larger arguments that I'm making in this book. The first one is to show the multifaceted nature of emancipation and abolition in this region, in the lower Mississippi Valley. And then the second one is to show how, to give a little bit of a different twist on the conventional narrative of how the war became for the North, how the war became a war for freedom, a war to destroy slavery. So those are like the 2 big ideas that I want to get across in this book. And again, Louisiana is critically important to both of these things. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Okay, this is, it's maybe a little bit more complicated than it looks. But the first theme is to illustrate the multifaceted nature of emancipation and abolition in the lower Mississippi Valley. You don't necessarily have to be able to read all of the printing in the key that's at the top, and I'm going to explain what all of these lines and zigzags are. And I think it's really interesting the way they in a way kind of overlap, because they do show the complexity of emancipation and abolition. But we can identify the 5 major dimensions of emancipation and abolition in this region. And this is the only region of the Confederacy and of the South, I would suggest to you, where all 5 of these things are going on, right? Some of them are going on to a certain degree in other places and other states, but the lower Mississippi Valley is the only one that has all 5. So what we have first, in the sort of the gray area, here, gray, this gray here, Tennessee, gray down here, those are areas where military emancipation was taking place prior to the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, right? That's the date when Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing all slaves in areas that are in rebellion. But before that, right, before January 1st, 1863, as the Union Army is capturing Confederate territory, slaves are, of course, absconding from the plantations, taking flight with the Army of Freedom. And we know this. This has been well developed, right, in the last 40 or so years. And again, I've been able to participate in this scholarly revolution, which has reinterpreted the story of emancipation. So that's the first one. And we can think of this as limited military emancipation. The Confiscation Acts, which were enacted by Congress, there were two Confiscation Acts, and a number of other measures that were taken by the federal government to free slaves as a military policy, right, to weaken the Confederacy, but before the Emancipation Proclamation. The second one is the area that is all here, like within these kind of teeth, as it were. Right? These are areas that are included within the Emancipation Proclamation. So the second dimension is universal military emancipation, right? This is the freeing of all slaves in designated geographical areas. Now, when I say universal emancipation, I don't mean everywhere in the South, because there were places that were excluded, right? But everywhere in geographically designated areas that Lincoln said are in rebellion, all of the slaves are freed in those areas. Previously, before the Emancipation Proclamation, under the Confiscation Acts, only certain slaves were freed, at least in theory, right? The slaves of disloyal slaveholders, rather than the slaves of loyal slaveholders. They tried to make that distinction. But with the Emancipation Proclamation, it's now all slaves in designated areas, right? So whether a particular slaveholder was loyal or not didn't matter anymore with the Emancipation Proclamation. Okay, then thirdly, we have exclusions from the Emancipation Proclamation. And these are the areas that are marked by the horizontal white stripes. So Southern Louisiana, which was, when you read the wording of the Emancipation Proclamation, it explicitly excludes the 13 parishes of southeastern Louisiana, and also all of Tennessee is excluded. And Lincoln does this as a concession to unionists who are in the process of organizing loyal governments, right? And so that's why Lincoln excludes Southern Louisiana and Tennessee, because he doesn't want to alienate the loyal slaveholders, and he wants to draw them into a unionist government. So he excludes these areas. So that's the third dimension. The fourth dimension is state level abolition. Right? And this is marked by the diagonal lines going this way, right? And so state level abolition occurs first in Arkansas in March of 1864, and then in Louisiana in September of 64, and then in Tennessee in early 65. So 3 of the 4 states of this region abolished slavery during the war with the setting up of loyal unionist governments, right, that will abolish slavery in their state constitutions. Right? And I'm going to talk a little bit more about how that happens in Louisiana and sort of the other states as well. So that's the fourth dimension, if you will, of emancipation and abolition. And then the fifth one is abolition through federal civilian power rather than military power. And that applies to Mississippi, right? Mississippi abolishes slavery in August of 1865, once the war is over, under Andrew Johnson's Reconstruction policy, right? He tells the southern states that if you want to come back, you basically have to abolish slavery in your state constitutions and ratify the 13th Amendment. And so Mississippi does that, right? And then also the 13th Amendment, right, federal authority and federal power, will also prevent any state from later reintroducing slavery, right? So without the 13th Amendment, even if a state had abolished slavery, it could still theoretically reintroduce slavery at some point, right? So the 13th Amendment guarantees that even states that have already abolished slavery will not be allowed to do so in the future. Right, so those are the 5 major dimensions of emancipation and abolition that occur in the lower Mississippi Valley. And again, this is the only area of the Confederacy and of the South in which all 5 of these things are operating at one point or another. Because of teaching, it's almost like conditioned to stop and ask if there are any questions, right? And I'm sure there probably are many questions, because I probably thoroughly confused some of you. At this point, we'll just hold on and wait for the Q&A, and I'll hopefully clarify any questions. Okay, so that's the first major theme of this book, is to illustrate and elucidate the complexity of emancipation in this region. The second one is where things get a little bit more complicated. And here I kind of have to offer a kind of a very brief and abbreviated version. And arguably, this might be the more important part of the book. Because here, we scholars and we historians are always encouraged to think, like, what's the bigger argument that you're trying to make here, right? You can't just tell a story. You got to be making some kind of larger interpretive mark. Whether it's right or wrong, it doesn't matter, right? Just so long as you're, drawing some attention. I would like to think that this is right. But what I'm doing here is I'm kind of offering something of a corrective, as it were, of what I think we can call the traditional narrative of how the war becomes a war for freedom, right? And a war to abolish slavery. And it might sound a little bit hubristic. I recognize that, but I think that like the traditional scholarship on the destruction of slavery, which has been excellent, and some people whose work I absolutely admire, but I think we've kind of missed a little bit of the story. And I think that the lower Mississippi Valley and Louisiana in particular, I think helps us to kind of have a little bit better understanding of the process of how the war for the North becomes a war for freedom and a war to destroy slavery. The standard narrative, right? The standard narrative, and one of the key themes or central themes and central questions of the Civil War, and for historians who study the Civil War, is indeed how a war that begins strictly to preserve the Union winds up becoming a war for freedom. We have studied this, and there are, hundreds, if not thousands, of books and articles that study Lincoln and the process of emancipation. Who freed the slaves? Was it Lincoln who freed the slaves, or was it the slaves themselves driving the process from below, right? Emancipation as a social revolution, not something that was just declared by Lincoln from on high in the White House. And justifiably, much of this scholarship focuses, and it makes sense, on the Emancipation Proclamation. There's no question that the Emancipation Proclamation was one of the crucial turning points in all of American history, and I wouldn't deny that for a second. And so the conventional wisdom is, okay, we start off with a war, to preserve the Union, and no matter what interpretation you offer, everybody has the same markers, right? We can point to the same things, right? Key turning points where we can see that Lincoln's thinking is evolving, right? He's responding to events on the ground. And is he driving things? Is he just simply being forced into something that he doesn't want to do? Whatever your interpretation of Lincoln and emancipation is, we all point to the same markers. But in a way, I would very humbly suggest that that story is kind of missing something. This conventional narrative. And there's almost a kind of ritualistic or formulaic quality to many of the works on emancipation and the ending of slavery. Okay, we show the complicated process by which Lincoln comes to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. And then oftentimes you can almost sense like the author's not really sure, where do I go from here? And then we have what I would call the Black military experience digression, right? Where we talk about Port Hudson and the Native Guard and the 54th Massachusetts and Fortress Monroe, right? And so we talk about the Black military experience. And we do that in the summer in mid-1863. And then we come to the fall of 1863, and we have the 13th Amendment being introduced into Congress, right? So now we pick up the political narrative where we left off with the Emancipation Proclamation, and now we pick up with the beginnings of the 13th Amendment in the fall of 1863, and now the 13th Amendment will take us to the abolition of slavery, right? And that's admittedly a greatly simplified story, but that's kind of the general narrative. And we often think of the 13th Amendment as being intended as a standalone measure to give constitutional sanction to the Emancipation Proclamation, because the Emancipation Proclamation was only a military directive. So once the war is over, it's not going to apply, right? And then there's the question of what is the future of slavery actually going to be, right? And part of the conventional narrative is we assume once the Emancipation Proclamation has been issued, then assuming Northern military victory, slavery is doomed. And slavery, it cannot possibly survive, right, a war of Union victory once the Confederacy is militarily suppressed. But here's the problem. The Emancipation Proclamation doesn't get rid of slavery as a legal institution, right? That requires political means. Also, the 13th Amendment was never part of the plan. And Michael Vorenberg, who's written an excellent book on the 13th Amendment, and I use Michael Vorenberg's book a great deal in my own book, he shows conclusively that Americans before the Civil War did not think about amending the Constitution as a way of carrying out political and social change. We think today, because of everything that has happened since the Civil War, and particularly with the 20th century, right? If you want to bring about change, you amend the Constitution. prayer in schools, flag burning, gun control, abortion, whatever the case is, you change the Constitution, right? That's not how people thought before the Civil War. Nobody really thought about amending the Constitution as a way of carrying out political and social change. Yes, there were a few people who might have suggested that, right? But even the abolitionists, the most radical of the abolitionists, assumed that the states would abolish slavery. And in fact, what Michael Warrenberg shows in his study of the 13th Amendment, that one of the radical transformations that happens in American thinking is the idea of a constitutional amendment, right? But even for as a way of carrying through change. So nobody was thinking about a federal constitutional amendment as a way of ending slavery. So now think about this, right? Imagine a world not only without the 13th Amendment, because we can very easily do that before there was a 13th Amendment, right? But imagine a world in which people don't even think about amending the Constitution as a way of getting rid of slavery. The states will abolish slavery. And this is conventional thinking, right? This goes back to the origins of the Republic, what was called the federal consensus. The federal government has no power to do anything against slavery in the states. And the conventional thinking was that it would be the states that would abolish slavery. So this is the thinking of the large majority of Americans, both for and against abolition, going into the war, right? So this creates the conundrum. How are we going to get, for Lincoln and for the Republicans, how are we going to guarantee the return of the seceded states without slavery? Right? If the federal, it's not going to be through a federal constitutional amendment, right? It's going to have to be done at the state level. Okay, before the Emancipation Proclamation, as I noted, after the Union Army begins capturing Southern territory, particularly for our purposes, New Orleans and Southern Louisiana, but also Tennessee as well, Nashville and Memphis. But in Louisiana, now here's the problem. After Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, and there's a long story how that happens, right? And as I've noted, there's a large literature. Now the question is, what's going to happen now? Because the Unionists in New Orleans have been organizing. And before the Emancipation Proclamation, the Unionist coalition was made up of various different persons. It included some slaveholders who had supported secession. It included slaveholders who had opposed secession. It included non-slaveholders and others who had always been on kind of the periphery of Southern society, right? They were not part of the slaveholding elite and the political establishment. So this very diverse and fragile Unionist political coalition, now once Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, this drives a wedge into the Unionist coalition in Louisiana, right? Now, Louisiana Unionists are going to divide into free state and pro-slavery Unionists. And this is where the story gets really complicated, right? And this is where, this is what much of my book is about. And I couldn't possibly give, even a brief summary of what's happening, right, in 1863 and 64 and even into 1865. But let me try to give you a visual image, right? Most books on the destruction of slavery and on emancipation would usually spend this much on getting to the Emancipation Proclamation, right, which takes about 1.5 years from the beginning of the war, and then this much on the 3 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, right, from January 1st of 1863 till December of 1865. 3 years is this, right? And get to the proclamation is all of this. What my book is let's see, I lost the marker, but my book gets to the Emancipation Proclamation here, right? And it focuses a lot on Louisiana. But this is a fairly familiar story, right? But what's going on in Louisiana and the lower Mississippi Valley is crucially important to Lincoln's decision to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. But then the rest of the book is dealing with that 3-year period of how we get from the proclamation to ultimately the ratification of the 13th Amendment in December of 1865. And I think that's what the previous scholarship, and again, I realize this might sound a little bit arrogant, but this is, I think, where this excellent previous scholarship has kind of maybe missed something, because we just assume that if the North wins, slavery is done for, right? And what I'm trying to show is that is not the case, that both pro-slavery and free state or anti-slavery people both recognize this problem. That's why when Lincoln writes to Banks in November of 1863, he's saying, look, get going here, because the adverse element, right, they're working too. They're trying to return Louisiana to the Union as a pro-slavery state, right? So what you have in Louisiana is you wind up with two main groups, but three factions. You have a free state group, right? And then you have what are called conservative unionists or pro-slavery unionists, right? Now the free state people are divided into two factions. The radicals, who are more stronger supporters of meaningful Black freedom, and this does include the free people of color in New Orleans as well, right? They're not involved in formal politics, but they are part of this coalition. So within the free state group, you have the radicals and you have more moderates, right, who want to abolish slavery, but they're not really keen supporters of racial equality and civil rights, right? And then you have the pro-slavery unionists. So you have three factions, right? Two main groups, but three different factions. And throughout most of 1863, the free state radicals and moderates are working together, right? But they will eventually split in 1864, right, over the question of Black civil rights. Now, here's the thing. Because of our concerns, right, and our thinking today on Black civil rights and will emancipation, right, the question of why didn't the ending of slavery lead to real, meaningful racial equality? That's our concern today, right? So we usually focus on the infighting between the two free state groups. Why did the moderate group win out over the radicals, right? Why do we not have Black suffrage at the end of the war, as well as the abolition of slavery? And we tend to write off the conservative unionists as they have no hope. There's no way that they're going to be able to restore Louisiana as a slave state. And what I'm trying to suggest is we have to take the conservative unionists seriously, because people at the time took them seriously. It might seem like ludicrous in hindsight to think that, that the states could be restored with slavery, but both pro-slavery and anti-slavery advocates were very much aware of this, right? And so the real contest is not between the moderates and the radicals. The real contest is between the free state and the pro-slavery unionists, right? And this was a very real problem. Look, we can line up from one end of the day to the other. We can line up quotations from people at the time who were saying that, slavery is done for. Slavery will never survive the war. But you can find in the historical record an equal number of instances. And, when I started doing this project, this part of the project was not really part of the agenda. It was to demonstrate that. But then as I'm looking at the record, I say, wait, what are these people saying? Why are they saying this? And I have to confess, even when I taught this over the years, when I read stuff like Lincoln, what Lincoln is saying here, it doesn't make any sense. Like, wait, if the 13th Amendment is out there and we've got a federal abolition amendment that will ultimately get rid of slavery, then why is Lincoln worried about this? And why are all of these people who are expressing grave concerns about slavery somehow surviving? You've got the amendment. But again, once you take the amendment off the agenda, all of this stuff that doesn't seem to make sense suddenly falls into place. And everything that everybody is saying about the fears of slavery surviving the war suddenly makes sense. It's not paranoia, right? It's not delusion, because of the way people thought about the nature of the Union and the Constitution and what the states and what the federal government could do. So again, it may seem far-fetched and almost delusional from our perspective today to envision somehow that slavery might have survived the war, but I'm trying to suggest that it very much could. Michael Hahn, to give you just a couple of examples, right, to give you the flavor of what some of these people are saying. Michael Hahn, who will actually be, his picture's out there in the gallery. He's the first free state governor of Louisiana. He's elected in early 1864. Michael Hahn, but he's writing here in 1863, right? This is June of 1863. He writes to Lincoln, "The loyal people of the state are all in favor of a reorganization of a loyal state government. And he writes this in 63 again. The only question on which they are divided is as to whether a new constitution should be made or the old constitution of 1852 adhered to. Those in favor of a convention, a constitutional convention, and a new constitution are the more radical or free soil union men and expect to succeed in making a free soil constitution. Others whose interests are in the institution of slavery and who desire to preserve that institution are strongly opposed to a new constitution and are satisfied with the Constitution of 1852, the pro-slavery Constitution. Even as Hahn was writing these words to Lincoln, a delegation of conservative Unionist planters were in Washington soliciting Lincoln's support for organizing a new government based upon Louisiana's pro-slavery constitution and returning Louisiana, quote, to return to its full allegiance in the enjoyment of all rights and privileges exercised by the other states under the federal constitution. It didn't take a genius to figure out what they were talking about, right? The privilege of states to have slavery, whether or not they wanted to. In early 1864, the radical Free State leader, Benjamin Flanders, writes to Lincoln, "We are threatened with a division into Free State men and Copperhead interests. All the men who denounced your proclamations will unite and draw the pro-slavery men into a party with the hope of electing men who will bring back slavery and fasten it upon us for years. You have not," and then he writes to further emphasizes to Lincoln, "You have not abolished slavery, but only emancipated slaves in a portion of the state. There is nothing to prevent the continuance of this state as a slave state if the pro-slavery party gets control." Now, we know that the pro-slavery party never did get control, but that doesn't mean that it wasn't a possibility at the time, right? And with Lincoln's encouragement, and Banks will eventually organize the election of a free state government, and then that government will call for a constitutional convention which will abolish slavery, and then will be ratified by the voters in Unionist Louisiana in September of 1862. There's just a couple of things that I wanted to note here before finishing. I just want to note a couple of things in thinking about Reconstruction and what this will eventually mean for the post-war order. Firstly, is this wartime factionalism between, particularly once Louisiana does organize a loyal free state government and abolish slavery with a free state constitution, this is where the factional divisions between the moderates and the radicals, the free state people, will come into play, because this is really establishing the origins of what we know is going to be the vicious factional infighting amongst Louisiana Republicans during Reconstruction. And we know that this factional infighting amongst the Republicans, many historians have posited as one of the main reasons for the failure of Reconstruction. So we're kind of sowing the seeds. There's going to be a lot of change between the wartime situation and Reconstruction, but we're kind of sowing the seeds for this factional division, right, which will really cripple the Republican Party during Reconstruction. But we also see sometimes the very strained relations within the Black community, particularly between the free people of color and then the former enslaved population. They will eventually come together, right, and recognize their common interests against the foe of white supremacy. But at least during the wartime period, we do see some of these tensions between the free people of color trying to preserve their traditional status within a three-tiered racial order, right? White, free people of color, and enslaved Black. Eventually, the free people of color will begin to embrace a more universalist message, right? But there are going to be those tensions. And then even within the free people of color, if we can really split this finely between the Afro-Creole elite and the, what we might think of as the Afro-Anglo population and the free Black population. And so there are even tensions within the free Black population. And so these tensions will also manifest themselves after the war during Reconstruction. And it's particularly over the question of Black suffrage, right? And that's going to be really the key question that everybody is concerned about at the end of the war. And I think one of the things that Louisiana is unique for is that nowhere else did Black suffrage become part of the equation in thinking about Reconstruction faster or with more profound and important political implications than in Louisiana, right? And so the question of Black suffrage is right on the agenda from the beginning, right, of the beginning of Reconstruction because of the wartime experience. And as some of you in this audience may know, when Lincoln gives his last speech, he didn't know it was going to be his last speech, but on the evening of April 11th, 1865, 2 days after Robert E. Lee surrenders at Appomattox, Lincoln gives what will come to be his last speech. The word of Appomattox reached Washington, D.C. kind of in the evening of April 9th. And so then on the next day, on April 10th, a serenade came to the White House and wanted to hear Lincoln give a speech. And so he came out and said a few words, but he said, if you want to hear, I'll come back tomorrow and I will give you a more formal speech. And so a big crowd comes to the White House on the evening of April 11th, expecting a strong dose of triumphalism, right? We finally won the war. USA, USA, USA. What Lincoln does is he gives a disquisition and a lecture on Reconstruction, right? And particularly talking about the situation in Louisiana and defending his Louisiana government because many people were criticizing it because it had not implemented Black suffrage. And this is where Lincoln famously gives his endorsement of Black suffrage. Now, admittedly, it was limited to the soldiers and to the quote unquote intelligence, but for the first time in U.S. history, a sitting president has publicly endorsed Black suffrage, right? And I think this speaks how far Lincoln has come from his thinking at the beginning of the war, where he advocated colonization, right, to the end of the war, where he's advocating Black suffrage. And it's not just that. It's Black suffrage was understood by everybody to be the most explosive issue on the political agenda, right, as the war is ending. And Lincoln, who always very carefully calibrated, right, his political stances on things with Northern public opinion, no sooner is the war over than Lincoln has staked out a position really far in advance of Northern public opinion, right? So I think this really shows how far Lincoln has come, but also the importance of Louisiana in shaping the discourse and the discussion of what Reconstruction is going to be. And so I think I'm going to stop there and open the floor to any questions that you may have. But thank you very much.
Yes, thank you for that fantastic and interesting and informative talk. Very interesting. So, yes. Oh, yes. So I'll be walking around with the mic. If you have a question, we'll start over here. I definitely learned some in that talk.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Okay.
These communications between Louisiana and Lincoln, what was the time lag?
You know, that's a really good question. I have to confess, I'm often confused by this, and I wish I knew like the logistics of how like everyday life actually worked back then. And maybe Aaron knows this better, but you know, no, because really sometimes word moves, and it might have depended on the telegraph lines. I don't know. Sometimes word moves surprisingly quickly, like they know within days, right, of what's going on. And sometimes it takes, there's more of a time lag, right? And so I'm actually surprised in those, because we're so accustomed to think, oh, things were different back then. It took forever for word to travel. Not Louisiana, but Arkansas. When Arkansas has their Free State Convention in early 64, Lincoln knows pretty quickly what's going on, right? And there's actually an Arkansas delegation that's meeting at the White House even as the convention is going on. And it's almost like they kind of know what's going on. So there are certain instances in which word travels pretty quickly, but there are other instances like in which letters cross. You can tell, right? This letter has been written before he's gotten this letter. And then you have to kind of put together who knows what at what moment, right? And then it gets a little bit complicated. But but sometimes they know surprisingly, word does travel surprisingly quickly. And so Lincoln is able to like respond pretty quickly to what's going on.
Then I'll go to you next.
Oh, well, um, I guess being an engineer and being a project manager for many years, I know that whenever you have something that you want to build, you have to go through different stages. And it seems to me that what I understand Lincoln to have known and realized is that the political part, you could state it in some amendment, okay?
And I'm sorry,
I mean, the political part, he could give a speech and say, okay, now we've won the war. That's a fixed thing. We've
Mhm.
won the war. But he realized that in trying to bring justice to the table, so to speak,
Mhm.
that this was going to take time.
Oh, yeah.
And it was going to have to go through different phases. Okay. And I guess one of the things that I've wondered about, because even in 1941, when I was born and growing up, being the product of sharecropper family like the Governor Edwards always claimed to be a product, a
Mhm.
person of a sharecropper family. I've wondered whether or not that was one of the stages that I just happened to experience, because the little town that I grew up in, and you mentioned the name Han, okay, we went to Hanville High School.
Oh, yeah, sure. No, that is Hahn. That's Michael Hahn.
Probably not
Right.
related,
Yeah.
but anyhow, we were part of a sharecropper family, where schools were separate and that sort of thing. And, and the town that I grew up in, it was a model town built by carpetbaggers from the north that spent a lot of money, because of, I guess, financial reasons, and so forth. But I wondered if there were other reasons, okay, like, what are slaves what opportunities do slaves have to transition, okay, from where they were to where they will hope to go to,
Mhm.
okay? And I was wondering whether or not the sharecropper experience or whatever it was, okay, was all part of that, where people came down and they had a financial incentive to do some of this, but it was a way to where someone could move from the plantation, okay, to a sharecropping situation where they could own a little money. And in my case, I had some very close friends that once they had the money, they bought a garbage collections truck, started a garbage, became very successful in other situations like that. Okay, my wife is telling me I'm talking too much.
You've got about half a dozen really good questions there. No, I'm not, like, really, I mean, some of those things that you're identifying are some of the central questions that historians and scholars who have studied the Civil War and emancipation and slavery have studied. Race and class, Southern economic development and the lack of economic development, and who's driving it and why. Right? What are the hopes and the possibilities? What is Lincoln's thinking on this versus, right? Because we know that Lincoln is not around in the post-war. So I'm not trying to dodge the question, but you've got a whole bunch of stuff going on there. If I could for a moment exercise my prerogative, and try to boil it down to like what maybe Lincoln was thinking about these things, though I know that's not really exactly what you were asking. But we're so obsessed with like, what would Lincoln have done, right, if he's not killed? And what was his thinking on what, what the world is going to look like for the former enslaved people? What is freedom going to look like? What is Southern society going to look like? I dealt with this in my previous book, and I know this is not exactly the question that you were asking, but parts of the question that you're asking are kind of embedded in this, right? But Lincoln and race are those two great American obsessions, if you will, right? And the intersection of those two things. I don't have too much of a problem seeing Lincoln moving pretty quickly to what we would know would be the radical Republican position, equality before the law and black suffrage. That's not the problem. I think the problem with where you really run into where Lincoln would have run into a problem is on the economic question, because Lincoln was so much a product of Northern small property society, right? And that's the world that he envisioned. And how are you going to get, and property confiscation and land confiscation is never going to happen, right? That's not a possibility, right? So I think that like Lincoln would have really run into a problem. What would Lincoln have done on the question of economics, right? When you get into what the former slaves want. They want independence. They want autonomy. They want land. They wanted a meaningful freedom. The former slaveholders, the planters, and this is not to make moral judgments, there's a logic to their position. They want to revive the plantation economy and maintain white supremacy, right? And that's their agenda. And these two things are not, we know, the historical record told us those two things are not going to work well together, right? And so the problem that Lincoln would have confronted is not the racial question, it's the economic question, though recognizing that those two things are very closely related. And the question of social and economic class and race is one of the central questions that people study Southern history, and we're still trying to figure this out. Because so much of what oftentimes look racial, the racial question is masking an economic question. And we know with white sharecropping, right? Very similar situations, right? And there's a whole universe of, scholarship and understanding what's going on there. I don't know if I really answered your question, but again, you've had a whole bunch of really central, important questions in your comment. We're still trying to figure it out, right? True. We have a question.
We have another question back here. Yes.
What was the relationship between President Johnson and the Republican divisions within Louisiana? Did he have contact with one group or another group?
That's actually a really good question. And I do deal with that toward the end of the book, because the book does go through 1865. So I'm kind of dealing with the beginning of Reconstruction. And so, in the early period of Reconstruction, the Free State, the moderates and the radicals are forming the Republican Party. The conservative unionists are now kind of reconfiguring themselves as Democrats, right? And as black suffrage, particularly with the free people of color in New Orleans, but also black people in the countryside are pushing for black suffrage, right? Johnson now is putting his chips in with the conservative unionists, with the Democrats, right? Because now that black suffrage is becoming part of the equation. I didn't mention this in my talk because it was starting to run a little bit long, but in my epilogue, I jump ahead. It serves as a conclusion, but it also jumps ahead to the two major racial riots, the racial massacres, Memphis in May of 1866, and then of course New Orleans in July of 1866. And even those two events are 3 months apart, we often think of them almost as the same event. We often refer to Memphis and New Orleans because they are key turning points in turning Northern public opinion against Johnson's program, because now black people and even white Republicans are being slaughtered in the streets of the South. And in fact, it was what precipitated the New Orleans riot was the attempt to reconvene the 1864 Constitutional Convention with the specific purpose of disfranchising ex-Confederates and bringing about black suffrage. And everybody understood what that meant. That was going to bring a political revolution. And Johnson is, of course, supporting, the attempt to try to suppress and the reconvening of the convention. And how perfect is it, right, that the two cities at either end of the lower Mississippi Valley are crucial, right, in the turning of Johnson's Reconstruction program. In Memphis, it was about black soldiers, and in New Orleans, it was about black suffrage. But let me say one thing about Johnson. We know Johnson is one of the worst presidents in American history, right? We understand that. But here's where I had to kind of, I kind of had to like forget about that. Because in talking about Andrew Johnson, because Andrew Johnson was military governor of Tennessee, right? So he's in charge of what's going on in Tennessee, and he's part of the Free State Coalition in Tennessee. Now, we know that Johnson becomes one of the worst presidents in American history, but I didn't know that during the Civil War. Nobody knew that during the Civil War, right? Andrew Johnson did a really good job as military governor of Tennessee. He really has to be commended. He demonstrated tremendous personal bravery during the war. Confederates put a price on his head. They wanted to kill him because with Johnson, it was always personal, right? And they wanted to kill Johnson. But I had to kind of be a historian and forget everything that I know about what's going to happen later and give Johnson his due. And Johnson actually has to be commended for having done a really good job. It's when he becomes president that the true colors really, show through with Johnson. And he throws his chips in with the conservatives, and we know where that winds up going. But Johnson did a really good job during the war. Got to give him credit, as strange as it might sound.
Any other questions for Dr. Rodrigue? Yeah. Oh, another one.
A little follow-up on Johnson. It appears that he was not informed about what was going on in New Orleans. In other words, Stanton got the information. He did not transmit it to Johnson at a time when he could have said, okay, cool with you guys, let's not do this. But he was never informed, and then he was held responsible for what happened.
No, it's true. I mean, there's been some, some debate about what Johnson did know and what he didn't know and what was going on, because of course, Stanton was Lincoln's man and he was a radical, and the idea that the radicals did, there's the suggestion that the radicals, did in a way kind of provoke it as a catastrophe to discredit Johnson's Reconstruction program. But I think everybody knew something was going to happen once the word went out to reconvene the Constitutional Convention. Even under the best of circumstances, 2 years later, to reconvene the convention was highly questionable. Now, technically, the convention could be reconvened for any reason. People expected that, okay, if the Constitution is voted down in 64, then we're going to have to reconvene a convention and do it all over again. But nobody anticipated, right, that the convention would be called back into session once the Constitution had been approved to kind of amend the Constitution. But once it was clear that the convention was going to meet, everybody knew that something was going to happen. Like whether Johnson knew all of the specific details, it was clear that this was going to be a very explosive situation. And of course, it did wind up blowing up.
How do you address Andrew Johnson's role in the upcoming election that allows him to be able to succeed? The role that he played with the Southern conservatives in light of they call it the Freedmen's Bureau concept that evolved, and what happened when the soldiers and all were removed from the South. Did you go that far in your book?
No, no. Admittedly, in this book, I cut off at the end of 1865 when the 13th Amendment is formally ratified. That's where my
I thought
story.
that's what you said.
Yeah.
And consequently, my question really follows after that. And-
But I mean, I've done, work on that anyway. I'm not quite sure what your question was though, with when you said the upcoming election.
Well, I was thinking about your applause of Andrew Johnson's role when you want to give him credit for contributions he's made. And I wondered then, what did you think about his further role as they were trying to make changes in the South when he helped remove the soldiers who were in the southern states?
Yeah, well, again, unfortunately, Johnson's record is pretty bad once he becomes.
Yeah, that's a good point.
But see that again, that was the challenge I faced, is I had to forget that. Like I couldn't let that color my thinking in assessing Johnson because that's later. And that's what the historian has to do, is try to understand what people understand at this particular time. And indeed, that's what my whole book was trying to do with this, abolition. We can't think that because we think today that there's going to be a 13th Amendment, that's not what people at the time were thinking. And that's why we have to understand what they understood